Welcome, everybody. Zach Spear here, and sitting here with Mr. Perry Marshall. And Perry, welcome.
It's good to be here. There's a great opportunity to respond to the creation research article and talk to people, particularly who come from a creation background the way that I did. So,
absolutely. So for those of you that don't know, I can't imagine that you don't, but Perry authored the book Evolution 2.0. And I'm not going to spoil any of the surprises, but there was a 11-page expose, if you will, by the CRS, the Creation Research Society, and in their quarterly magazine, they wrote an 11-page review of the book. And so we're going to address some of the things in that review today.
Yeah, and tell a lot of my story. We're because I think there's a lot of background here that's relevant, and some of this I haven't really told before. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. So, I think what we'll start with is just kind of where this all began. So, I mean, I know you came from a pretty interesting background in the church, and I don't want to steal any of that story from you, but I also don't think a lot of people know that story. So, how did you grow up? Like, what started this?
Well, so I grew up at a super conservative church in Lincoln, Nebraska, and my dad became a pastor there when I was about 10 or 11. And before that, my dad had worked at this organization called Back to the Bible. He had actually moved from Lincoln, Nebraska, or from North Carolina, where he grew up, and my mom's from Virginia, and they moved to Nebraska. And so, this voyage to this place where they didn't know anybody, and they started working in Lincoln, Nebraska, and so, not quite a missionary, but pretty close to it, right? Working for a nonprofit Christian organization, and for that matter, my grandpa Marshall was a Baptist minister in Virginia. My uncle Glenn worked for Transworld Radio and worked as a missionary in Bonaire in the Caribbean for a number of years. I had an uncle on my mom's side who went to Bob Jones University and worked for a Christian radio station. My wife's brother has a PhD in church history, runs a relief organization called Children's Relief International. So I've been surrounded by Christian missionaries, Christian scholarship all my life. And that's where I come from. And so my dad was a minister at this church. And I remember when I was about 14 or 15, this guy named John Whitcomb, author of a very famous book called The Early Earth, he came to our church, and for a week, it was like every night for a week he came and he had this presentation and this one and this one and this one, and so he was advocating flood geology. And it's actually a whole view of young earth creationism, which originally comes from the Seventh-day Adventists. A lot of people don't know that. But I thought it was awesome. It was way better than the normal stuff that I was used to. Now, what was I normally used to? Well, let me give you an idea, okay? To give you an idea how rigorous, my Bible education was. My pastor started Romans in like the first sermon on Romans. I think he got to verse 2 or maybe verse 3. And you're flipping in your Bibles, like you're in Isaiah, and now we're in Jeremiah, and now we're in Ephesians, and now we're in Philippians, and now we're in John, and like every single thing would be cross-referenced. And this is the 1970s, 1980s. To me, the whole Bible was hyperlinked. It took him 5 years to get through Romans. Okay?
Wow.
Yeah. Like, this is serious. Like, we are going, and there's Greek and there's Hebrew and like all this kind of stuff. And this is exactly what I grew up in. Now, it's probably not too much of a surprise to say that this was a little tedious. And I didn't always enjoy it. But when Dr. Whitcomb came, man, that was great because I was a science geek, right? And he's talking about the age of the earth, and he's talking about the Bible and the Tower of Babel and Noah and the flood and all this kind of stuff. And it's a tour de force. And I thought it was great.
You're a science geek before this happened.
Oh yeah. I've been a science geek all my life. I mean, I remember when I was 5 years old, I got in trouble because I took a hammer to my dad's transistor radio, which he was rather fond of his transistor radio, you know. He didn't really like the broken pieces of circuit board, but, you know, it's like, I got to look at all this stuff that's in there, man, look at all these circuits, you know, and so, I was building electrical stuff when I was probably 8, and I was building stereo equipment starting at age 13. So, I mean, I was a pretty serious science geek, and so I loved the John Whitcomb thing, and I ate it all up. It's like, man, I didn't know how all this fits together. Now, if you fast forward a little bit, little by little, things start to pop up where you go, hey, wait a minute. For example, I remember being in second grade reading dinosaur books, and it would talk about the dinosaurs being 65 million years old. And I went to a Christian school, and they, just laugh at that. Oh, that's just the secular scientist. That's, you know, okay. So all right. So I'm not going to believe in this millions of years stuff. But I remember after I got out of college and I was working as an engineer, and I got into this conversation with a bunch of coworkers about faith stuff, and I was fairly competent with some of that. But this one guy made a comment. He goes, all right, but if you're going to sit here and try to tell me that the earth is 6,000 years old and stuff, I'm not signing up for that deal. And I realized as soon as he said it, I was not equipped to counter what he said. And by this time, I have an electrical engineering degree, and there's a lot of things that I know. And for example, I know the speed of light. And I knew at some point along the way, I came to understand that when an astronomer tells you that a star is 100 million light years away, there's about 6 different ways to arrive at that number, and they all tell you the same thing. And that star really is 100 million light years away. And so that means the light left the star 100 million light years ago. And now a lot of people kind of try to dodge this, but this is actually a very, very simple fundamental thing. First of all, it's like division. Okay? Like, how fast does light travel? How long does it take to get here? How far is that? How long is that? It's old. That starlight is very, very old. And furthermore, as an electrical engineer, I knew something that most people don't know, which was how intrinsically bound up the speed of light is with all of physics.
Sure.
Okay, it's a constant. And so E equals mc squared. Energy equals matter times the speed of light squared. And that's a statement of both the relationship between matter and energy. Okay, it tells you how much energy is for how much matter. And you combine that with the conservation of matter and energy. It also speaks to a fixed amount of energy in the universe. And there's all kinds of engineering problems and physics problems where you take those two things and you figure stuff out. You figure out how much energy came out of a chemical reaction. And the thing is, it's all right. It's all true. And physics itself fits together like this beautifully. It's like a clock or something where you've got all these gears and they all work perfectly. Okay. And this is why we can design chips and cell phones, and most electronic things are modeled on computers before they're ever built. I worked at a company that designed a chip, and they spent months and months and months and months running simulations on this thing, because once it's in silicon, you can't change it. And so I knew, because of the precision of the laws of physics, and I measured the speed of light in a lab when I was a sophomore in physics, and even things like the length of a USB cable is based on the speed of light. Like USB cables aren't 100 feet long because they won't work. They're only like 6 feet long. Mm-hmm. That's because of the speed of light. So there's all these things. So I knew that the Earth had to be old. There was no way around this. And, and then if you say, oh, well, the universe was made to look old, but it's not really old. Well, that automatically means that most of astronomy and most of cosmology is the study of an illusion. Because literally, you can turn your telescope, you could look at stars that are near, stars that are far, and depending on where you point your telescope in the sky, you are time traveling to earlier and earlier and earlier points in space, right? So we can almost witness the birth of the universe, depending on where we turn this. When the Hubble telescope came out in the 90s, we started just having tons of new data, new information about the history of the universe. And so there wasn't any question whatsoever that the Earth was old. And so when my friend said this, it was like, but I hadn't quite figured this out. Okay. Now later, I encountered Hugh Ross, who is an old Earth creationist, and he's an astronomer and an astrophysicist. And Hugh made perfect sense out of all this stuff. And he explained the Big Bang, and he said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he explained how when George Lemaitre formulated the Big Bang Theory in the 30s, everybody laughed at him, and they were inclined to not believe him because he was a Catholic priest, and they thought he was biased, and everybody thought the universe was eternally old. But he said, no, it's all moving outward, and if you wind it backward, it all goes down to a single point. And that was the Big Bang Theory. People hated the Big Bang Theory because it sounded like creation. I was like, wow, that sounds great. And I find out about this amazing fine-tuning of the universe, and how, if the expansion rate of the Big Bang had been less or more to the 120th decimal place, you wouldn't even have stars, because they wouldn't have formed. It would have either sprayed out like a mist and never even formed matter, or it would have all collapsed in on itself. And the difference between one and the other is so fine, like it's finer than any human engineered anything. And so as I started to discover cosmology, I was just immensely impressed. And to be honest with you, what I discovered from cosmology and astronomy was way more impressive than anything Dr. Whitcomb talked about in his Young Earth Creation talk. So it didn't take any kind of a big battle or anything for me to realize, oh, the universe is old. A day in Genesis is a period of time. It's not 24 hours. And so, hey, there's no problem. It's fine.
So when Dr. Wickham was first bringing this up when you were younger, you weren't fighting this at the time.
No, I completely agreed with it. But you go through life and you start picking up things, and you go to zoos and you go to museums and you learn stuff, and what always has weight with me is, hey Xander, you're moving around way too much. The sound of you moving is going to be very noticeable. So sorry, it's not going to be fun, but I just need you to stay put.
I need to be here to select the focus on each of you.
So one thing that has a lot of gravity with me is is not when people are preaching at me and giving me an agenda about, okay, so this is how old the earth is, or something like this. That has less weight. What has more weight is when somebody has information about something that speaks to one of these questions, but they don't have a dog in the hunt and their career depends on it. Okay? So, for example, guys that drill for oil. Being employed in the petroleum industry only requires that you be good at drilling for oil. Okay? They don't care if you're in old earth or you're young earth or, that's not on the job application. That doesn't matter. It's, can you do the practical science of whatever geology you need to know to drill for oil? Well, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but, like when my brother Brian and I started having this tussle about faith, one of the things I quickly figured out is you'll have a really hard time finding a professional geologist who drills for oil who thinks the earth is young. You'll almost never find one anywhere. It's like, they're like, well, of course the earth is old. There's all these layers and layers and layers. And we can come back to that later. Mm-hmm. But again, like, you don't even need that fine grain of an analysis. You only need the speed of light, which is a constant. And physics, if speed of light isn't a constant, physics falls apart. It just unravels. And physics works so well. It's probably the most exact science that exists. And electrical engineering heavily depends on all of this physics, all the way to semiconductor materials and everything. And so there was just the proposition that the earth was young had no support as far as I was concerned. And so I had already gotten over this, but then turns out Brian was still a young earth creationist, and he had this very tightly woven, the young earth creation story blended with Christian theology. He was firmly in that world. And so, and this was one of the things that really unraveled for him. So again, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, and maybe we need to back up a couple steps.
No, it's okay. So when you're in the early stages, Dr. Whitcomb is giving the talks. You're kind of learning about this young earth creation stuff for the very first time, totally accepting it. So the thing that I was kind of raised in a somewhat similar way, and to be honest, I've never, I haven't made these, and I haven't made hyper conclusions either way. I'm still kind of learning.
Right.
So I guess the big thing that comes to my mind, just because I've had a lot of, experiences in this type of environment, is just the exact nature of answers that are given. So, I guess what the biggest thing that comes to my mind is when Dr. Whitcomb is giving these speeches and talking about the history of the 6,000-year-old Earth, is there room for questions? If you bring him, if you bring him some of these old Earth facts, is there room to even talk about it, or is it very exact? No, you can't ask any questions.
Well, so this gets you into some really basic questions about the nature of knowledge and epistemology, which is how do you know what you know? And so, I was raised in this very tight doctrinal evangelical construction of how the world works, and it had certain assumptions, and I would describe the whole belief system as pretty brittle. So it's it encompasses a whole lot of things, and if you start messing with one thing, the whole thing falls apart and it fails to work. And this is what Brian is experiencing. So let me kind of describe our path a little bit. So I have to tell you a story about several things. So when I was a junior in college, I took an English class from this wonderful, amazing professor named Dr. Knoll, and he might have been the most loved professor on the entire campus. The guy was ruthlessly engaging, brilliantly smart, took his job very seriously. And so we're studying everything from Beowulf to Shakespeare and like everything in between. And every class is just mind blowing. Like this literature coming into it, it would seem dull. He would just make it come alive, and he would show you how English literature is really the heartbeat of Western civilization, and all the questions and the, you know, what is life about and what is a good human being and all. And so it was just incredibly stimulating, and he was a hugely influential person for me. And one day, let's call my pastor Mr. G, okay? One day we're sitting in class, and he's talking about how in life you progress. And a natural progression of life is to go from exact answers to being willing and able to deal with ambiguity. And he says, you know, a lot of kids, they'll start out in science and math because science and math are very exact and it's very comforting. But he said the older you get, the more comfortable you get with ambiguity and gray areas in human beings and inexact answers and all of the complexity of relationships and politics. And as you grow up, you move from the exact answers world to the, you know, the much more difficult world of human beings. And he said, and if you want to spend the rest of your life searching for exact answers, you can go to Mr. G's church. And I'm like, hey, wait a minute. I grew up there. That's fighting words. That's like, man.
That's totally fighting words, yeah.
Right. And I felt as though he had just hauled off and just slapped me, right? Because I loved this guy. And
Mr. G. Or
no, I loved Mr. Knoll, Dr. Knoll. Okay, I love Dr. Knoll. Now, Mr. G was, we'll get into this later, Mr. G was a pretty complex character, okay? He had some really great strengths. He had some really big weaknesses. But Dr. Knoll, I'm sitting there, I'm 20 years old, and he makes this statement. I'm like, ow! You know, and I walk out of the class, and for the whole rest of the afternoon, I was just walking around in a daze. And then probably about 2 or 3 hours later, I was like, hey, wait a minute. I don't go to that church anymore. Like, I'd actually left within the previous year. I had left. I'm like, why did I leave? Because the exact answers had become so excruciatingly exact that they were almost like driving people out.
And what do you mean by exact answers?
Okay, so where I grew up, it was kind of like the Bible tells you everything you need to know. So let me give you a real life example of this, okay? So when I was 12, my mom went bipolar, okay? But except nobody knew what was going on, okay? So if you've ever lived with a person with bipolar personality disorder, and, you know, 1 minute they're your best friend, and the next minute they flip around and they're your worst enemy, and they're hurling accusations at you, and like you walk in the door and you never know what you're in for, and there was arguing all the time and fighting all the time, and our family was just a wreck for like a year and a half. And mom, it was like mom was just on this bender, and she's doing all these weird things, and she's saying weird things to people, and you'd come home from school and the fighting would start and it would go until bedtime, and it was just bedlam. And my dad's trying to figure out what to do about this, and the church is putting pressure on him. Like,
because your dad is...
My dad's a pastor, okay? And you got the verses about a pastor should have control of his home, and children who believe, and like all this kind of stuff. and he's a pastor, he's an elder, he's got all this responsibility, he's teaching classes, and they're putting pressure on him, like, man, you get control of your wife. Like, what is going on with her? Like, what's all this rebellion, and what's all this anger, and why isn't she being a submissive wife like she's supposed to? And like, I remember a couple times the senior pastor coming over and trying to talk things through, and things are just spinning out of control. And finally, my dad got her to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist went through his stuff, and he diagnosed her as having bipolar disorder with mild schizophrenia, and he prescribed an antipsychotic drug, which is called Haldol. And the board of elders found out that he had taken her to a psychiatrist.
Okay. This is Mr. G's church.
This is Mr. G's church.
Okay.
And it couldn't have been more than like 2 days later, Mr. G and this other guy came to our house and sat in our living room, and we had this family meeting, and they explained to us that because my mom was out of control, and because my dad had taken my mom to a psychiatrist, my dad was being asked to resign from the board of elders, resign from his position, and step down to an administrative job. The following Sunday, Mr. G announced to the entire congregation of 2,000 people that because of problems with Betty and the family, Bob has resigned from his position, and he's okay. I mean, it was just absolutely humiliating. And the straw that broke the camel's back was that they had taken my mom to a psychiatrist. In their opinion, psychology and psychiatry were just really a secular religion that was an alternative to Christianity, and Freud and all of that was just an alternate worldview, and we're not going to have any of that around here, and it will not be tolerated. And while we're having this family meeting, I'm sitting there. I'm 13 years old, and I'm just kind of listening. My sister was 18, and she was livid. My sister was furious, and she knew this was unjust. And my parents are in tears, and I mean, it's just awful. And she says to the other pastor that came with Mr. G, she goes, if people knew what your daughter does at night, you'd be resigning. And he said, Robin, we're not here to talk about my family today. We're here to talk about your family.
Wow.
Okay. All right. So Dad gets demoted, and everybody's...
So real quick. So when Dad took Mom to the psychiatrist, what happened? Did she get... What was the result?
So he prescribed this drug called Haldol, and she went on this drug, and literally within days, she was acting differently. She was subdued, she was level-headed, she was sane, she was also very remorseful. It was like she realized what havoc she had created. And of course, it's very obvious immediately this was a medical problem, right? This was not some spiritual rebellion or, whatever. I mean, she had been kind of delusional. Like, she would say things like, well, Bob, you're not really my husband. My real husband went somewhere else, and you're just like a substitute that got sent in and I have to put up with, like, it was just weird. And she was... How
long was this period?
Year and a half.
Okay, so it was not like a 2-day thing.
No. Well, year and a half of bedlam, and then she gets on this drug, and like, it was really immediate. Okay, and so now we're in the aftermath, right? So Mom has created bedlam in the family for a year and a half, and now she's remorseful. Dad's been demoted from his job. Everybody's wondering what's going on. Dad was, I mean, you know, like all the guys at work that when the elders would go out to lunch, he couldn't go, you know, so he was definitely in the out group. And, you know, and I have to say, like, there was a long string of people who, because they couldn't keep their families in line or something like that, that they ended up having to leave. So, like, remember the guy who said, "We're not here to talk about my family. We're here to talk about your family." Well, he had his turn like 2 years later. His son, who I knew, like, got caught smoking pot. He got fired from his job. And not only that, he kind of ran out of town. He tried to sell insurance. He tried to sell vitamins. And Mr. G just kind of tried to make sure that nobody would do business with him. Okay. I knew a maintenance guy because his daughter was partying or drinking or doing who knows what. Like, the maintenance guy had to resign from his job. So, like, I mean, this was really, really tight. And
no, I don't even know how to classify this type of a church fully. But I like, first, I guess the first question is there more church congregations like this?
Sure.
That's just, okay. I guess that's just
well,
interesting.
But I need to back up and tell you a couple other things. So, like, we would go see our relatives, and our relatives are like, "Man, dude, you got screwed. Like, you need to get out of that place." And my dad said, "No, I am going to vindicate myself." So Mr. G was a very, very smart, very articulate, very powerful, very persuasive guy. And hardly anybody would challenge him. But my dad wasn't afraid to challenge him. And so after going through all this, and then clearly this is a psychiatric problem, it's a medical issue, my mom gets on this medication, he gets in Mr. G's face and he goes, "You made a wrong judgment. This was a medical problem. This wasn't sin. This wasn't morality. This wasn't anything like this. You owe my wife an apology. And you owe me and my family an apology because we didn't do anything wrong. This was a medical issue." And he stood his ground. And Mr. G relented. And 9 months later, my dad got his old job back. And Mr. G wrote a letter of apology and encouragement to my mom saying, you know, "We believe in you." And, like, now, this didn't keep my mom from being afraid of him for the rest of her life. And she literally was. She was terrified of this guy. But, you know, at least he tried to make it right. Now, about maybe a month after my dad got reinstated, he found out he had cancer. And kidney out, cancer gone. Year and a half later, cancer comes back. In fact, I remember I was in the basement near the bottom of the stairs. I heard my dad walk in the door, and my mom comes in the kitchen, and I hear my dad say to my mom, "Betty, I've got cancer again." And she, like, crumpled, like, she just went to pieces, and she's crying, and I listened to this whole conversation, like, well, you know, we're going to see if we can get some treatments and try to solve this. But a year and a half after that, my dad died, and I was 17.
So I can't help but notice a little bit of it. So your mom was made better by the medicine.
Yeah.
Did your dad go in for medical treatment as well, or was that looked down upon?
No, that was okay. They weren't against that.
Okay.
Yeah, Dad, he had cancer treatments in Houston. He had cancer treatments in Maryland, and and the church was extremely supportive. Okay, like extremely supportive. Like people brought casseroles, and there was a couple of generous people that, like, Bob, I'll pay for your plane tickets. You know, just tell me how much your plane tickets are to go to the cancer treatments, and we'll pay for those. And they lived in Maryland for a month doing a cancer treatment. Another family took me and my brother in, and like all kinds of stuff. In fact, to just give you an idea of how supportive they were, about 3 months before my dad died, it had become clear, like, this stuff just isn't working, and he's going downhill. And people that were in the know knew this. And so my parents are at church one night, and the sermon ends early, and Mr. G says, I'd like Bob and Betty to come up on the stage. And it looks like something's up, but like everybody knows except them, and they go up on the stage, and Mr. G basically says, well, you know, we're in the book of Job, and Job's about hardships, and you've had a lot of Job in your life, and so we decided to try to help you out. And we sent out a fundraiser letter because we know, Bob, we know you've never been to California, and we know you'd like to go to California. And so we raised some money, and we got $10,000, and you guys can go to California. And like, I mean, my parents were just speechless, right? And like, there's a standing ovation, and so then my dad gets out his travel atlas and his budget and everything. He figured out how we could go. So we lived in Nebraska. We'd never been west of Colorado. He figured out how to hit every single state west of Nebraska, including Alaska and Hawaii. He worked it all into the budget. Right. Wow. Now we were not a wealthy family, like, not by any means. We hardly ever went anywhere on an airplane, like, ever. And like, we're flying to Alaska, we're flying to Hawaii. It was amazing. I wasn't used to even having money. It was kind of a shock to my system. It was like, well, aren't we going to need this money later? Dad's going to die, you know. But anyway, it's like, no, we're going to have a good vacation. We're going to celebrate. You know, God can take care of the rest later, but, you know, this is our time. And so we had this 5-week vacation. It was amazing. And, you know, and then after my dad died, there's more casseroles and more people, you know, helping with stuff. And there was a guy in the church who he would call up my mom, who, you know, my mom was like not the highest of professional qualifications. Okay. I mean, this is a lady, she's been a full-time mom for years and years. She's on psychiatric medication. She still struggles with the bipolar stuff to some degree. You know, not the most competent person in the world. She's working at JCPenney selling jewelry, you know, which is little more than a minimum wage job. There was a guy in the church. He was a successful entrepreneur. He actually had a technology company. He would call my mom and he would say, so Betty, how much are you short this month? And he would write a check. Like, he would make her tell him. Wow. And I'm going to guess he gave her $800 a month for a couple years. You know? So what you had there was a very controlling, very exacting, abusive church, frankly, but where if you were in the good graces, like, everybody took very good care of each other, right? And so, like, you know, I have a lot of mixed feelings about all this. Now, my dad had a friend named Verge. And Verge ran the counseling department at this church. And Verge had, but by the way, my dad had a degree in psychology from a Christian college in North Carolina. And Verge and Dad were always talking about counseling people and helping people. I don't know how many people my dad counseled at some level or another, but this is a guy who he knew the bones in people's closets, because if you get into that kind of stuff, you're just gonna be exposed to it. And so my dad told Verge, he said, after I die, you better, Mr. G is going to come after your counseling department because he doesn't like it. Mr. G thought, so Mr. G was now convinced that psychiatry was valid. Okay, because psychiatry is medicine. Psychiatry is like biochemistry and and the brain and it's a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. Okay, but he thought psychology was just like a secular religion. He hated psychology. Well, what Verge was all about was, we're going to take the best of Christian ideas, we're in biblical and Holy Spirit and all this other stuff, but if there are insights from the psychological world that help us understand people's problems, and we're going to do that too, and we're going to put it all together. Mr. G did not like this. Okay. Not one bit. And so, sure enough, after my dad died, it was war on the counseling department. And eventually, Mr. G just dropped the hammer on the counseling department. He fired my friend's dad, my dad's friend, Verge, and the whole church split
because of that.
Yeah, it was that, and it was like also kind of personality issues with Mr. G. And I remember I went to see Mr. G when I was 19, and the church is falling apart. And I said, so I got a question. I said, our church has a radio ministry. They have a TV ministry. St. Paul didn't have radio and TV, but we're using that. But, last week in your sermon, you said St. Paul didn't have psychology, so we're not going to use it. So why are we using technology, in this department, but not in this department? And basically the answer I got was, because I'm the boss and I don't like it. I mean, really, okay. If you ever have a one-on-one conversation with a very powerful person who's kind of intimidates you, but like you actually just sit down, sometimes you'll get answers that kind of surprise you. He was being fairly forthright. He's like, well, I'm in charge of this church and I just don't want it. Like, well, okay. And I remember going home and thinking really, really hard about this, because what Mr. G was trying to do was be like a biblical purist. Sure. And it was kind of like, if you could look at it from his point of view, it's like, man, I got these 66 books of the Bible. The Bible is the most complex piece of literature that there is. Like, I think I can absolutely say that as a true statement. There is nothing like the Bible, and it's hyperlinked, and there's nothing been written about more than the Bible by even there's not even a close second, okay? It's an incredibly subtle and complex document. I think maybe you could say to Mr. G, like, man, I got my hands full just figuring this out without trying to incorporate everything else on top of it. But I sat there and I really thought hard about it, and I thought, okay, what Verge wanted to do was filter psychology through the Bible and through the Christian lens and figure out, what do I keep and what do I leave behind? And that's what Verge wanted to do. And here's the conclusion I came to. If I only work within the framework of the Bible, I will never question my own assumptions. I won't even know what they are.
Mm-hmm.
Because nobody reads the Bible in a vacuum. Everybody comes to any piece of literature with their presuppositions and everything. If I take any field, psychology, science, anything else, and I filter it through the Bible, every time I do that, I'll learn more about the Bible and I'll learn more about psychology. I'll learn more about the Bible. I'll learn more about science, because anytime you take two different worlds, and of course the Bible was all written 2,000 plus years ago, anytime you take two worlds that come from completely different places and you merge them together, each will shed huge amount of light on the other. It's just like if you've only lived in the United States, you don't even know what it means to be an American. Mm-hmm. I've been to 37 countries. I remember the first time I went out of the country, I spent a week in Brazil. Oh my word. The head shift that I experienced, right? Then I go to China, then I go to Taiwan, I go to Hong Kong, I go to Germany, I go to the UK, and every time I'd go to one of these other countries, I would suddenly see the world from this whole new perspective. And so I'm actually kind of proud of myself that at age 19, I realized you do not build a little, you do not circle the wagons around the Bible. You do not. Okay, this thing, there have been more people have come after this thing and tried to destroy it and tried to burn it and tried to discredit it and proclaim that it's going to be out of date and all. This has been going on for 4,000 years, okay? Nobody is going to destroy this thing. It is the summit of Western literature, and you bring all comers. Okay, bring it on. And so I made that decision, and that's why I left Mr. G's church. It was like there's dead bodies everywhere from all of this commotion. Mm-hmm. This place is turning into a bit of a tyranny, quite frankly. And you're not allowed to question anything. And so Dr. Knoll makes this comment about if you want to spend the rest of your life searching for exact answers, go to Mr. G's church. And then it takes me about 2 hours and I suddenly realize, hey, wait a minute, Perry, you know what he's really telling you? He's telling you that you're growing up, even though you're 20 years old and you're just barely trying to figure this stuff out. Like, you're headed in the right direction. And it was like, wow, now I really love Dr. Knoll. Like, this guy is good. This guy is good. And I've seen this. And I think all these stories are kind of important. And so I immensely value having been in an environment where you would spend 5 years studying Romans. I mean, I hardly know anybody else who has that much background. They taught me how to think. Right? It's like the internet comes along in the 1990s. I'm like, I know what a hyperlink is. They invented those with Bible commentaries hundreds of years ago. You would look up a word and you would see how many places it appears, and you would develop like the World Wide Web of the Bible inside your own head, right? And so I can't tell you how much this education served me. You could probably compare it to conservative Jews or Jesuits or something like that. It was immensely valuable, and I've carried it with me ever since.
Yeah, that's great. So when you're talking about your mom getting better because of medicine, so it's almost like science saved the day, if you will. I mean, I might be being a little too pointed with that.
Well, it kind of, not very perfectly, I'll tell you. I mean, that medication was kind of horrible, but it was better than being psychotic. Yeah.
So it did something that maybe the church wasn't providing.
Yeah.
But then...
And couldn't have. The church could have never fixed this.
And then a little bit later, Dad gets cancer,
Yeah.
and it's almost like the church comes back and almost in a way does save the day.
Yeah. Science couldn't save my dad. Cancer treatments couldn't save my dad. But yeah, our faith community came around us and really took care of us. And I kind of wonder, when people don't really have a community like that, and I know that most people don't, how do they deal? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I frequently think about that a lot too. Okay, so you're in Dr. Knoll's class, you leave, you've just been mind blown.
Yeah.
It's 3 hours later and you're like, holy crap, I'm growing up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I realize, there's a lot of ambiguity in human relationships. And I think if you really are a scholar of the Bible and you read the story, the Bible is a huge story of ambiguity. I don't think it's a story of exact answers. You can read the stories of Joseph or Jacob or Abraham or Solomon or David, and they're all about situations where there's almost never one single perfect way to handle things. Joseph is a real hero because of the Pharaoh's dream and saving Egypt and everything. But at the same time, by the time the famine cycle is all completely over, the Egyptian government owns everything. Okay, they've bought everything from everybody and has become a tyrannical state. And a few hundred years later, the Jews are in slavery, right? So even the best efforts of Joseph couldn't help but create more problematic situations that then had to be solved. And so it really tells you that the way life is. But I have to contrast that ambiguity with knowing what you get, at least in the hard sciences, which are exact in the way that Mr. G wanted the Bible to be, but was not. Okay? So basic physics and electronics and Ohm's law and Newton's law and speed of light and all this stuff, it's as exact as anybody would ever want anything to be. But of course, then you push that to the edges and you find it has problems too. You get into quantum mechanics where all of a sudden everything is weird and ambiguous, right? And then if you go to higher levels of science, so you start to get into biology and it becomes so complex that it does not fit reductionist models anymore, even though lots of people try to force it into reductionist models, okay? And maybe the insights that I was getting in my early 20s about all of this, you could say, prepared me for seeing the same problems being recapitulated in science, where people wanted biology to be an exact science or a reductionist science, and it actually didn't fit reductionism at all. Now, this is probably getting way ahead of the game, but let's just make an observation that there are certain people, and I almost think it's more a personality type than anything. I think fundamentalist is a personality type.
Totally.
Okay.
I was one for almost.
There's certain kinds. It's not everybody, but there are certain kinds of people that just crave exact answers. They want things to be right. They want it to be black and white. They want to know absolutely. And I think for a lot of people, it turns into this idolatry. Okay. And what it does is it shuts you down from asking certain questions. There's just certain questions that aren't allowed. Hey, this is the rule book. We're sticking to the rules,
sure.
Right? The Pharisees in the New Testament, the battle between Jesus and the Pharisees, these are people who craved exact answers, and they would sit and they would come up with these hair-splitting, so just exactly what can you do on the Sabbath, what can't you do, and they would completely miss the point of the whole entire thing, that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? And so I think people who have embraced the process of maturity will be fighting fundamentalists their whole entire life. And there's fundamentalists in politics, and there's fundamentalists in religion, and there's fundamentalists in science. And you have to make a distinction between fundamentals, which exist in every field and which are very important, versus fundamentalism, which is when you make the fundamentals basically into a religion.
Right.
And humans are just so prone to do this. It's
a comfort.
It's comfort food, man. It's Bob Evans' restaurant with
it's cornbread,
right,
mashed potatoes,
right.
Absolutely. So you're basically in fundamentalism land.
Yes. I was we were even proud of it. You know, back in the 80s, I'm a fundamentalist, man. It wasn't quite as dirty of a word as it became, later on with 9/11 and all of that.
Sure.
Yeah, we were fundamentalists, and we were proud of it.
Yeah, totally. So you're fundamentalism and proud. All this stuff happens. Dr. Knoll happens. Life gets kind of shaken up.
Yeah.
Did you start questioning? Now, are you questioning things that happened at Mr. G's church, or is that not happened yet?
Well, no, I was questioning it like as soon as I left. I was, but it really started processing it after I moved to Chicago. So I moved to Chicago when I was probably 23. And I had been out of Mr. G's church for a couple of years. I'd actually gone to church in Omaha because, like, the refugees were all in Lincoln, when the shrapnel started going everywhere. Okay, like all these people are going all these directions, and like you couldn't go anywhere without like getting into discussion about Mr. G, and I didn't want that. So my sister started going to church in Omaha where nobody's like in that scene, and we just went with her. And so I just kind of set it aside and I didn't really process it. But I came to Chicago, and it's like, okay, I want to find a place where we can worship in a faith community. And I end up at Willow Creek. Okay, which was for a time the largest church in the United States. It's the largest church in Chicago now. If you compare Mr. G's church to Willow Creek, that is like sex change operation. It's like Willow was like mainstream, not right wing, like Christian Protestant church, and they're a lot less anal about everything. In fact, it was really just a completely different way of approaching everything.